All right. Today's episode is a bonus episode. What's a bonus episode, you ask? Well, just think of yourself as that Starbucks barista who put a 4-leaf clover into someone's cappuccino. You get a bonus because, let's face it, you deserve it. This is a companion episode to episode 14 with Abe Herrera. So if you haven't listened to that, I suggest you give that a listen first. My two guests today are Canadians, so it's important to understand as they tell their story that as Canadians, they are exceedingly nice. To exemplify this, the Colorado Durango crew likes to recount a story from the first run-in we had with them in Mexico. Team Durango had shared a shuttle with the Canadians on the Alsa Seca, but they paddled separately. The Canadians were nowhere in sight at the takeout, and having forgotten to pack any beers, the Durango crew proceeded to drink the 12-pack the Canadians had left behind. When the Canadians did show up a bit later and saw what had unfolded, the Durango crew suddenly felt a bit embarrassed for being a bunch of assholes and admitted to drinking all of their beer. But all the Canadians had to say was, "Sorry, we were so pokey, eh?" Okay, let's get on with the show. But before we begin, here's a quick shout out to the people who help sponsor the show. Today's episode is sponsored by Four Corners Riversports. To me, Four Corners is exactly what a paddling shop should be. It's staffed with dedicated river people who know the sport inside and out and are all about having fun and getting people outside. Four Corners Riversports is located in Durango, Colorado. They're a full-service paddle sports retail and rental store. If you're looking to get on the water, look no further than Four Corners Riversports. Call them at 970-259-3893 or visit their website at www.riversports.com. This episode is also sponsored by Taylor Barker with the group real estate Steamboat. I've known and paddled with Taylor for years, and he brings passion to everything he does. Steamboat Springs is a wonderful town with the Yampa River running right through it and has a vibrant and friendly boating community. If you're thinking of making a move to the Steamboat area or purchasing a vacation home, be sure to get in touch with Taylor. He's happy to give you a lay of the land, the real estate market, and to help find the perfect property for you. You can reach him at 336-314-4353 or by email at taylor@brokerintheboat.com. And you can find those links in the show notes. This podcast is being featured on paddlinglife.com. Paddlinglife.com does a wonderful job of finding all the most interesting happenings in the world of paddling and bringing them straight to you in the form of news, interviews, articles, videos, and more. Check out paddlinglife.com. All right, here's your bonus. Hello, and welcome to Tales from the Crips, a whitewater storytelling podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Cripps. So this story came to me by way of a campfire in Idaho that once again exhibits how in whitewater it's a small world. I met my guest, Adam, almost a decade ago in Mexico, and he was traveling around there paddling and unwisely befriended a group from Durango, Colorado. And it was through my own unwise connection with that group that I found myself paddling the South Fork of the Salmon River in Idaho with Adam this past June. And around the campfire, our group got into a discussion about rescue techniques and equipment. And I had just done an interview with Abe Herrera for the podcast, and I began to mention a story about how he was on the Foss River. And then all of a sudden I saw Adam light up, and he said something like, "I have a crazy pin story about the Foss." And to which I said, "Wait a minute, you were the Canadian group that Abe was telling me about that had a pin for 2 hours on the Foss?" And he was like, "That's the one." And I said, "Well, we need to bring you on for a little complimentary story to Abe's own little misadventure on the Foss." So I've rounded up Adam and his friend Ben, who is also on that trip. And we're going to get into a little retelling of this epic pin rescue that happened to these guys' group. So Adam and Ben, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Kevin. Thanks for having us. Good to be on.
Hey, Kevin.
All right.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
So this was actually, I have to say that this story hits a little bit close to home for me because I had my own little recent misadventure where I was on the Middle Feather hit a log that I didn't see, got a pretty bad injury that I'm dealing with right now. And like wood is always kind of there as a weird thing, and this weird variable that's out there, when you're running whitewater. And so I've actually paddled the Foss a few times when I was out in Washington, but it's not really a destination river. So maybe you guys can set the stage a little bit. Like, this was in 2014, so this was some time ago, and you had a pretty good group. What were you doing out there? How long were you there? And how did you end up paddling the Foss?
So this was 2014, and the runs in that drainage along that highway. So you've got the Foss, the Miller, and the Money, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe the Rapid as well, that all drain into the Skykomish. My memory might be a little foggy on that. But we had been paddling the Miller the day prior, a smaller group of us. And then I think I remember, Ben, you came down and joined us for the Foss, maybe along with someone else. We had a big group. We had like 7 people on the river. And we had never done the Foss. So we were in the area, and we thought it was like a chill class 4 run. It seemed pretty straightforward, and we thought we'd put on and give her a go.
Yeah, I can't really remember how I ended up there. Someone said they were paddling the Foss, and I just drove down from Vancouver and just sort of met you guys there. So yeah, it was just me.
But I assume, Ben, you knew Adam and some of the crew from when he was in BC or prior trips.
Yeah, I knew the whole crew.
Yeah, this was our regular crew. So I was based out of Chilliwack at the time, which is about an hour and a half east of Vancouver, where Ben lived. And we were kind of the usual crew that would get together and paddle stuff in the Fraser Valley or up the Sea to Sky route, and also Vancouver Island or kind of wherever else.
Yeah, and so I assume you were all pretty good boaters as well. The Foss River was like you said, it's kind of a class 4. Probably wasn't something that was on your radar as something to be concerned about.
Yeah, we weren't thinking concern really too much besides wood. We had always, or at least I had always heard about wood being a danger on the Foss. We had a pretty solid crew. Like Riley Adams was out there. We had Annie and Denny, Tegan Owens, Allison Homer. There was a good number of us. There was a lot of experience, and it was a crew that knows how to deal with things on the river, especially like a class 4 river. I remember putting on at the top, and there was a lot of wood right away. So there's 2 put-ins for the Foss, and we put in at the upper put-in. I don't know if you remember, Ben, but there was a bridge, and there was a lot of wood like right off the bat. And we had a whole bunch of wood portages kind of through easier rapids until we got to the main meat of the run. So that kind of gave us a preview of what was coming up, for sure.
I remember that as well when I was there. I think we had ignorantly put in at that top put in, not knowing any better that the locals have a lower put in, and had the same experience where there were huge log jams up there that we had to do some portages around. But I guess that is a good sign that wood is something to be concerned about. So what was I know when I was there, I remember it was like classic Pacific Northwest weather where the sky was matted with every shade of gray. Like what was the weather you guys had when you were there?
It was kind of...
I don't know if it was raining, but it was definitely cloudy.
Yeah.
I remember the potholes in the road driving in were filled with water.
So you put on the... So you had a pretty good sized group. 8, did you say like 8 people or something like that? I didn't quite count the number.
7.
But
We were 7 total. And yeah, I do remember it was like 10 to 15 degrees Celsius. And it was just one of those classic PNW drizzly, not quite raining and switching between rain, cloudy, sunshine. One of those type days.
So you all put on, you're dealing with some of the wood at the put in, but you get to the main part of the run, you start paddling down, and how are things progressing?
Yeah, it was kind of funny at the put in. So at the put in, dealing with all the wood in the first stretches, we were having kind of a competition to see who could stay in their boat the most or not even get out of their boat. And I think two or three of us actually managed to get through those flats without having to get out of our boats to get down,
Nice.
and it was kind of fun. And then the only rapids, like I remember after the wood, it kind of got a little bit boulder gardeny, but nothing too steep or serious or anything. And the only rapid I actually remember of note on that run is the Barbie and Ken, or Ken and Barbie, however it goes. And I remember, so the first one, whether it's Ken or Barbie, it seems to me it's a little bit steeper and it narrows down at the bottom. So I remember we looked at that one, if I'm not mistaken, and a few of us looked from the right, a few of us from the left, and Scott and I were together looking at it. And then Scott and I were actually the first two to rally down that first rapid. And it was pretty straightforward. We got out, or we didn't get out. We like eddied out between the two rapids, and we were we were kind of looking at the rapid that had the wood in it. We couldn't see the wood, and I remember that was the big problem. I don't know if you remember, Kevin. Do you remember seeing any wood or like encountering any on it, any of those big rapids there, the bigger rapids?
I don't remember anything being in play. I think I was there in 2012, so it was a couple years before you were there. But yeah, I mean, I remember seeing some wood, and it's not, as I recall, my memory is probably fuzzier than you, but I remember it not being a particularly big river, like maybe a 500 to 1,000 CFS type river.
Yeah, that's about right. I
Yeah, it
remember
was.
there was kind of like a S turn thing right above, I think, and there was like a log in play in maybe the bottom left or something, and we all kind of went around that. We were
Oh yeah,
definitely like just sort of boat scouting because it wasn't, you could generally see down it.
yeah, yeah. The only reason I remember that we did scout the first of Ken and Barbie was because Scott actually wrote that in his part of my blog. So my blog had both perspectives. It had like my full perspective and then Scott's full perspective. And I remember, so he had wrote that, and that kind of jogged my memory to that.
Yeah, so maybe you detected that there was something big coming up that was a little bit bigger than everything else. And as I recall the same thing, that Ken and Barbie Rapid was kind of the crux of the run, probably a 4 plus type rapid, but nothing particularly distinctive or no obvious hazards in there.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I remember when we were going into Barbie, I believe it's called, the second part of the rapid. It's a little bit less steep than Ken was, and it was a little bit more, it was a little bit wider, kind of spread out whitewater, and it didn't have like a clear line like Ken did. And we we kind of, the first ones of us that went down, we started center or right, and then went down towards the right at the bottom, and we saw the wood, or at least parts of the wood, and we were signaling to Scott from the bottom to kind of go right at some point or stay more right, not really knowing how serious the danger was either at that point. And then yeah, Scott, he didn't really take note of that, or he didn't really see us because there was kind of a boulder garden fence at the bottom that made it wasn't like super straightforward to see people at the bottom. And so he ended up
Yeah.
going kind of right into the middle, and that's where the whole situation kind of began.
It sounded like I read your blog write up, which, as you said, gave Scott's perspective as well, and it sounded like he was kind of looking at the rapid coming in and thinking that it just looked a little bit manky on the right, and he had a cleaner line if he went right to, or if he started center and pushed right. But it turned out that line he was on was just sound like right at the heart of the tip of this log, huh?
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. Like I remember it all kind of looked manky. But I remember in the center left there was this weird rock, and you could kind of tell that there was some kind of a it looked like the water was doing something funny in there to me. So you didn't really know what was up. What was your impression, Ben? What did you think of that whole part? Do you remember?
Yeah, I mean, I think I ran down the right generally, kind of bounced down. But yeah, it was like this boulder fence. There was maybe like three or four sort of slots you could go through in between boulders. And um, I went down the right. I think a couple people went sort of down the left, and then Scott ended up in the middle. And yeah, it was a little hard to read coming into it. And honestly, I don't think I even saw this log. I just sort of went around it or missed it. Um, and yeah, like by the time I eddied out, like basically Scott was just stuck in the middle of the river, and we like at least I don't know what your impression was, Adam, but like I didn't even really know what was going on at first. And it was hard to figure it out because the river was pretty loud, and like Scott couldn't like yell and explain it.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. The most interesting thing was I remember he had stopped, but I didn't think anything was really wrong. Like I saw that he was stopped, but figured he was just kind of broached on something and would be able to get off of it. And then his paddle came downstream. Like I remember sitting in the eddy downstream, and there comes his paddle. And one of our people actually went downstream after his paddle and ended up swimming, going after his paddle.
Oh no.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I remember that.
Shit show unfolds, huh?
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. Next level.
yeah.
Was anybody aware that he was swimming?
Yeah,
We,
yeah. We all knew.
we were aware, and there was a good like 5 minutes where we were just like, should someone go after, or should we deal with this pin, or
Oh, we're gonna have to
Yeah.
edit out the name there. But yeah, it was pretty funny. I think we were all at that point we were kind of laughing because we didn't know how serious it was, and that all kind of happened at the same time ish as we were realizing that Scott was actually stuck.
But it sounds like you guys were all eddied out and pretty much realized right away that something had happened to Scott. You just didn't. It wasn't readily apparent that it was something serious.
Yeah, exactly. It kind of became apparent when his paddle came down because he let go of his paddle because of the situation that he was in. If it wasn't that serious, he would have held onto his paddle.
Yeah,
So
that makes
that
sense.
was our clue to start making our way upstream. So we had kind of half the group on one side, half the group on the other side of the river, going upstream because he was like very much in the middle of the river. It really was not an ideal place for a rescue. And we realized right away that he was in a worse situation than we thought, than we had realized, because he could breathe and his head was above water, but he had to kind of hold his head up a little bit, or it wasn't super easy for him to stay in at least a semi-comfortable position. So the first thing we did was get ropes right across the river and to him so that he could use that to, along with kind of the wood he was trapped on, another piece of wood, to support himself in a more comfortable position for sure.
So you kind of, it sounds like you've transitioned from this point from oh, something weird is happening to, oh shit, Scott's in trouble. We better stabilize him. We better start thinking about how to rescue him.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And I remember um, by then, even then, I think, I don't know what you thought, Ben, but my impression even at that point was like, oh, maybe he'll be able to wiggle himself out, or it doesn't seem like, it really seemed like less than it was, It was
Hmm.
it was like just a super sneaky piece of wood, not apparent at all.
Yeah, I mean, like what happened, and you read the blog post, but basically, like the tip of this log went through his spray skirt into his cockpit and pinned his leg in the boat. And it's not. I mean, I don't think it's really something I ever thought about before, and like it's kind of a complicated thing to explain, I guess, and like Scott couldn't like you can't really communicate that with hand signals.
Yeah.
So we were kind of like on the bank, just like okay, we were like okay, we need to stabilize him because there's water kind of like up to his neck, and it's putting pressure on him, and we were going to keep his head above water. But then above that, we were like almost like okay, like we don't really know what's going on here, and it took a little while to figure out that like his legs were actually trapped in the boat like that.
Yeah, and it was really weird because I had actually seen a pin, exactly the same style of pin with a log trapped into someone's cockpit just a few years before on the Chilliwack Canyon. There's like this early curve, and the Chilliwack Canyon it's not a very difficult piece of whitewater. It's kind of like class 3 or minus. It gets a bit harder when it's high, and they had put in logs for the salmon and for the fish. And we had a kayaker who got trapped on one of these logs in
Oh,
very
no way.
much the same way. Yeah. And but luckily it was in a place where rescue was relatively easy.
Okay.
So it was the second time I'd seen something like that anyway. But yeah, it was a real challenge to figure out what to do because he couldn't really move. He obviously couldn't get out of his boat, couldn't come off the log. So we ended up setting up a huge Z drag power adding rope bonanza kind of on each side of the river, trying to figure out what would work best as we were doing that. And I remember from the one side, Scott ended up clipping our Z drag, which I think was like a 3-to-1 at that point, onto his bow. Is that right, Ben? Do you remember that?
I think he just clipped it onto the hard point right behind the cockpit because that was
Yeah,
kind of what he could reach.
right.
So basically you were able to get ropes to him. He was capable enough to catch the ropes and managed to clip on to the nearest grab loop that he had on the sound like Dagger Nomad was what he was in.
Yeah,
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 exactly.
and
But it wasn't
we
easy.
yeah. And we kind of like so we used two ropes tied together to stabilize him, and then we had like basically two ropes on to river right, I think, and then we got like another. It was probably like another two ropes on the river left side. So anyway, we're up to like six ropes there,
Oh wow.
and I think we lost one at one point.
Yeah.
Um,
Did
so
you have a leader emerging at this point? Someone that was kind of coordinating the rescue, or how did the interplay go between everybody that was trying to do stuff?
I mean, it was because we had both sides of the river, and you couldn't readily talk one side of the river to the other because the river was so loud, right? We were relying really on the river signals to get any kind of messages across. And it's almost as if between the both sides, we were kind of independently doing things and then getting Scott whatever tools so he could do whatever he could. I remember you had Allison and myself on the one side of the river at one point, and then the rest of you, I think, were on the other side. And at one point, we had at least one person going across the river, kind of trying to tie things together. But man, it's been so long, I don't actually remember who that was.
Yeah. But once you had the Z drag set up, I guess you figured you somehow coordinated that one side was going to start pulling and seeing what would happen. Like where did it go from there?
Yeah.
yeah,
So we had, go ahead, Ben.
yeah. So we were kind of relying on Scott to tell us like which way to pull, because like his leg was trapped, right, and he had to figure out sort of get enough space to wriggle free. So I think he initially told us to pull to the right, and I was on the right. So we set up a 3-1, and there was like 2 or 3 people pulling on it, and it didn't move at all. And at that point, we're like, okay, well, I mean, I guess we could get more leverage here. So I kind of had to just like figure out how to do a 5-1 on the fly, because it's not really something I practiced, but
Yeah.
it was more of like build up from first principles sort of thing, and it took a little while, and we had like gear issues, and we had to just like basically take all our gear and just put it in a pile and figure out like what we needed for it.
Oh, wow. Do you have any clue at that point how much time had transpired? Like once you started trying to set up the 5-1?
Like at least a half hour.
Wow.
But yeah, like so then I guess we were able to pull on that and move it like a few inches, and I think at that point Scott like was able to shift a little bit. And I think from there he kind of like shifted onto the back cockpit a little bit, and I think it sounded like you guys pulled from the left bank after that, because the boat shifted, and that's kind of how we had to do it.
Yeah, I remember that. So you talk about like there being a leader, and actually thinking about it now, it was actually a really good example of teamwork without one distinct leader, the way I remember it. Like everyone was kind of we all paddled together a lot, and we were all used to doing things together a lot in this crew. So it was pretty synchronous when we had to put this rescue together and do things. And we were all pretty good on the river, so we were very lucky in a good position. I guess more good decision making than luck that we all had so much equipment and ropes and everything. But yeah, I remember. So after you from the right were kind of pulling him out, then we were pulling from the left, and realized we needed more power from the one side. And I think the way we got him out was, so he had like cut his skirt and part of one of his shoes by this point to try and get himself out too. And
Yeah.
we ended up, I think we rocked him kind of with the 5-1 and 3-1. We like rocked him back and forth. And that's how we eventually got him off the log. Is that what you remember, Ben? Or
Yeah, there's a bit of back and forth. I don't know. Like I feel like after we hit like the hour mark, and we were like, it was like getting a little desperate almost. Like Scott was getting cold, and we were like, okay, we need to get him off this thing, but we didn't really know like which direction to pull. So I think we just sort of just started pulling harder at one point, and and then
I remember.
yeah.
Do you remember like at one point we couldn't pull too hard in one direction because it was just like compressing his leg.
Yeah.
So we had to kind of rethink and retool. I think that when like we actually had to try and pull in different directions because of that. And if I remember correctly, Scott actually repositioned one of the carabiners to somewhere different. Like he's a very smart guy, right? And he was, even in this situation, able to put together these solutions, which really helped because from either side, we couldn't do too much directly with it, right? He had to manipulate everything in the river right beside himself. That's kind of how I remember that.
There's got to be some fear there that you're going to make the situation worse, right? Like it sounds like basically the water pressure, the log, the boat was kind of pinching his leg and trapping him in the boat. I mean, yet he was relatively stable. You kind of want to make sure you're not going to crush his leg when you shift the boat the wrong way, right? And I don't know that in a situation like that you can think too much about that, but it sounds like you were sort of leaving it up to Scott to determine what the best move was.
Yeah, I mean, you asked about a leader, and it was like I think Scott was essentially the leader in his own rescue.
Yeah, because
But
he was the only one that really knew what his exact situation was, right? Like you couldn't see where his leg was trapped or anything like that. That
yeah,
makes sense.
he had to be, and we were really worried after it was putting pressure on his leg, about pulling the right way and manipulating him the right way. And he's the only person who knew that. But he was communicating really well with us. Like he'd say, no, that way, or more that way, or
Okay.
that way, and then that way. It was pretty good, but there was definitely a feeling of kind of helplessness at one point. I remember starting to set in because it just was going so long
Yeah.
and
And
progress
that
was
that
so
that
slow.
cold has got to be a major factor there, right? You're saying it's 50s Fahrenheit or teens and whatever you guys use to measure temperature, and like you're getting. I mean, the water's got to be very cold, right? Like coming down there, you're at some elevation and you're in a cold area.
Dude, the water
So
was freezing. That's what I remember. The water was like so cold. Do you remember that, Ben?
Yeah, well, not particularly, but I do remember like watching Scott sort of start like shivering. He was like shaking his hands because they were like going numb, probably. And yeah,
yeah.
he was having to manipulate all these ropes and carabiners.
So what's the bottom line then? What kind of was the turning point where he was starting to finally get freed?
So the starting
Well,
point,
yeah.
go ahead, Ben.
Um, yeah, I mean, I think he was able to sort of shift onto the cockpit, the back of the cockpit at some point, but then he was still stuck, and we weren't. Uh, we didn't. He didn't quite have his leg out, and then I don't really remember exactly what happened, but I just remember like almost being like sent, like I don't know what left to do here, and then he was just like free and he just swam out. So I don't know if you remember it better, Adam. But
So what I remember is uh, kind of pulling from one side and then pulling from the other and very gradually changing the position of his boat around the lock until I think it opened up just enough space so that his leg could be freed eventually. Um, but yeah, it seemed like we'd been trying that for a long time and it wasn't getting anywhere. And then all of a sudden, yeah, he was like free. So
Okay,
it
you
kind of
opened up
was.
just enough shift that he finally was able to get his leg out, and then at that point was he holding onto the stabilization line, or what happened once he freed himself?
So I remember when he came out, he kind of just went downstream, like right away. Is that what you remember, Ben? Like he kind of just swam down.
yeah, I think he just like basically just dove over the log,
Yeah.
just
He
got
had like
himself
no
up and over the
energy.
thing. Yeah,
I'm sure. I'm sure.
Yeah, we got him out
Uh,
on the side and we were like massaging him and he was shivering a ton. He was super cold, like almost hypothermic,
hmm.
if not hypothermic. And we were like, yeah, we were just trying to give him body heat kind of any way we could, really.
So how
And
long did you? How long were you there on shore trying to warm him up?
probably a decent amount of time, probably a good like 5 to 15 minutes, I think. Like it was quite a while. Just like
Was
he
anybody
was.
was was everyone still there at the river, or did anyone leave to try to go get a car, or go get help, or was there anybody like trying to signal outside help?
No, so everyone was at the river, and I remember there was a takeout kind of right after that, or very soon after that, and then we we managed to. I think we could even just like pull Scott's. We managed to get his boat out to his boat freed when he freed, and we got his
Hmm.
boat. His boat was in great condition, but he just was able, I think, to walk to this takeout kind of, and we got his boat to this takeout, and then I remember like half through. took out there, and the other half went down after his paddle, which we still had no idea where that was, somewhere downstream. And I think we got his paddle back, actually, if I'm not mistaken, which was pretty cool.
Wow.
And
So once it sounds like once he got out of the river, you kind of, other than being very cold, you were able to evaluate him and see that he was in reasonably good shape and he could walk back out to the road and was more or less okay at that point.
yeah, I mean, he was definitely distressed because he was so cold. Like, he was not happy about being so cold, and he was super thankful that he had a dry suit. And if I remember correctly, it was a pretty old dry suit. Like, it wasn't new, and it was leaking a little bit. So water kind of went in the dry suit, but he had a fleece, like a nice thick fleece under the dry suit as his underlayer. And I think, like we were talking about it, if he didn't have that fleece, it would have been so much worse, so much worse. And if he didn't have a dry suit, he probably would have been, hypothermic like an hour before or something, or half hour before. So it was
Did you end up taking him to a hospital or anything afterwards to get evaluated?
No, by
We
the
just went to
time,
the bar.
yeah, yeah, we went to like a Mexican restaurant. Like, we got out.
Kayaker solution.
Do you remember, Ben? We got out and we ran into Brett.
No?
Is that Brett Barton?
Yeah, we ran into
The
Brett
guy that
Barton.
lives out
I
there.
don't know.
That's
Yeah,
hilarious.
yes.
I paddled the Foss with him as well when I was out there. That guy's a character.
So there was another American group paddling the Foss the same day that we did. I believe it was after us, and they had someone, from what I heard, get trapped on the same log at the same place that same day. And I think it was kind of the rogue Seattle crew, like Brett, Ellie Wheat, Scott Weidlich, Dan Petronellis, and those guys, if I'm not mistaken. And so that was kind of interesting. But yeah, some of us ran into Brett. I don't know if it was the crew that got out at the end of the Foss or the crew that went after the paddle into the Skykomish, which I think was me, Annie, and Denny, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, it made the Mexican food
Crazy.
that much better. And we had beers after it, so that was good too.
So I've always hated the saying when people say, "Oh, if I could live my life all over again, I'd do it all the same," because that just seems absurd to me. Like I can think of lots of things within the past 12 hours I do differently. But as a kind of a retrospect on this situation, if you kind of knew this whole thing was going to unfold again, and you could go back in time and from the point that you see him pinned, how would you have handled the situation differently, or would you have?
What do you think, Ben?
Yeah, I mean, it was all has to do with like how much we knew at the time, and maybe there was like, I don't know, he did a pretty good job communicating. That was the biggest variable to me, just not really knowing what was going on. Like, I think we had good gear, and we had like, enough people on the scene, and like enough knowledgeable people. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it was just sort of a tough situation.
The one thing I would have liked to have for myself, like at the time, my knowledge about ropes and rescue skills was pretty fresh. But I remember thinking, like, I think Ben was more proficient with ropes than I was, for example. So were a few other people. And I remember thinking, like, I should be definitely more proficient with ropes was the main thing. But it's good, like, we had a good mix of people, and a lot of them were super proficient, / maybe climbers as well, so that helped.
Yeah, I do,
for sure.
I do remember like just sort of puzzling and struggling through that 5-1, and like trying to figure out how to lock it off without losing any progress we made. And
Yeah, that was
like we had some press six. I think like we put some knots in the rope, and probably in the wrong spot, and they got to the pulleys, and there was that sort of shenanigans. Like we could have put them in better places. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe if we
Yeah.
moved a bit slower and been a bit more deliberate with our rope building, it might have been. But we were trying to go fast, right? We were trying to like get them out of there quickly, and maybe if we'd been more efficient with our time, it would have ended up saving time in the end. Kind of always wondered, but it's hard to say.
Yeah. I mean, the cool thing is, it sounds like you guys did a lot of things right. Like you had the equipment, even like Scott had a knife that was apparently sufficient to cut through a spray skirt, which is there was an incident out here where this guy probably he sold 1,000 bear claws to the kayaking community because he had some story that where he was pinned and had to cut through his skirt, and he was saying having that serrated knife was really important because and it was also very cold, and so having a little finger hold in the knife, like a hole that your finger goes through, was key because he was kind of losing his grip on the knife as he got colder. But he was able to like keep a hold of it and keep sawing through it because of that finger hold, and the serration was able to get through the Kevlar and the skirt and everything. But he also made the point of like having a blunt tip on the knife versus a sharp tip, because like in a situation like that, you can end up cutting yourself, right, and doing more harm than good. But yeah, that was interesting. One of the things Abe mentioned, I think, as part of this story, if I recall correctly, his incident on the same log was that he ended up starting to carry all his pin kit stuff on his body instead of in his boat, because he had wasted a bunch of time running to the boat and grabbing it and then coming back to do it. I thought that was an interesting takeaway.
I definitely started, I don't know if it was then, but I definitely started doing that as well at some point.
I can tell you that Abe was somewhat horrified at the idea that it took 2 hours for you guys to get him out. He thought 20 minutes was like outrageous. Of course, they were different. Same log, pin situations are different, right? Like who knows what would have happened if he was there, if he could have done better or not. Did you consider at all? Did he have like a tow tether or anything on there? Because that's one thing I talked to Abe a lot about. He likes the tow tether as a way to stabilize people, as a way to get a rope on a body and potentially extract someone from a situation like that. Did that come into play at all?
No, we didn't use one of those.
I
don't
know
know if
that would
Scott
have
had one
helped.
on his.
I think was the back of his boat kind of underwater?
Mm.
I think his whole boat was underwater.
So
Yeah,
he may have
like
not
we could.
been able to access it anyway, is what you're saying?
No, like I think we could barely see his boat actually,
Yeah.
Yeah, on
and
the blog
and we
post, I think his perspective was his boat was basically underwater. Yeah, and it sounded like his head was just barely above water.
and we definitely could not safely get to his boat, if I remember correctly. Like
Yeah,
I
it
don't know
was like the
how.
middle of the river.
Yeah, and we couldn't. I remember at one point we were thinking about how we could paddle down, like someone could paddle down to him, and I don't even think we could safely do that without putting him in a worse situation potentially, or putting another person in a bad situation, the way I remember it.
One thing I remember you telling me, Adam, when we were on the salmon, was that you always carry gloves in your PFD wherever you go. Um, that was, I thought, an interesting takeaway that I hadn't really thought of, and I think that was informed by this kind of situation where someone gets very cold. Did did you change anything else about like what you bring with you on the river, or what you put in your person or your boat?
So I did, like, I learned a ton of lessons from this that have definitely stuck with me even to today. And I think some of the main things were just like wearing a dry suit when you're creeking, even if it's a bit warmer. If the water's cold, it's like it can be super important if you need it and there's a real bad situation that lasts a long time in cold water. Like a dry suit could really save your life if the situation's bad enough, right? the other thing was like the hard points on the boat. If his boat didn't have hard points, I don't think he would have been able to get the carabiner around them. Like he could just barely get the carabiner around the hard points as it was from his position and with the water and where his boat was. If he had, so his other boat was a Prion Pure, which he didn't have that day, and it has the soft points. And we were talking about it later, and I don't think it's questionable whether he would have been able to even clip on with the soft points and the amount of water pressure.
What do you mean by soft points?
So like the handles on the boat, like on the Nomad, they're like steel and they're hard.
Oh,
So
steel versus a fabric or like a rope or something.
Yeah, exactly. And the fabric ones, they can get like just pushed flush against the boat with enough water pressure.
Gotcha.
Right?
Yeah,
So that
yeah,
was actually that was like a bigger deal than I think people give it credit for. The
interesting.
fact that we all had throw bags. Oh yeah, a big thing that I started doing actually just before the rescue was making sure my throw bag had strong rope, like Spectra rope or something. Because if we had non-Spectra rope, I don't think our ropes would have toughed out what was going on. So I'd say like that's definitely a worthwhile investment. And other than that, it's just like keeping your river rescue skills up. I think I've renewed my river rescue skills or like taken courses more recently than I otherwise would have because of situations like that, specifically this situation, I guess. And that's kind of the main thing. Like if none of us knew how to do a Z drag proficiently or a 3-to-1 or a 5-to-1, it maybe would have been a worse situation, right? So
Yeah, I admit I've like poo-pooed the idea of like a Z-drag ever really being useful to extract a person. You know, I always figured, yeah, you're just extracting equipment, like stuff like that. You know, I've never, most of the time you just, right, like you're just pulling people with a rope. But that was this listening, like doing this podcast and hearing some of these stories. It's been interesting because I've realized that there are situations where you need to be able to set up a quick Z-drag potentially to save somebody, and that's I've actually gone out in my backyard and been like, all right, I haven't set up a Z-drag for a while. Let me practice this.
yeah, I mean, I guess the normal idea for a Z drag is you're not going to have time to do one to rescue a person, right? Because you're thinking like, oh, they're not going to be breathing because they're underwater or something. But yeah, it's not always the case. Or saving a person can be dependent on getting their equipment saved, which kind of what was going on, right? Like him and his equipment was kind of one with the log, and we had to just get them apart.
Yeah. Do you think there was anything around mindset here? Like, do you think there were any mistakes that were made in terms of like how you were running the river? I mean, you just chalk it up to bad luck, or was there anything that could have been improved?
I mean, the one thing I think about is like we didn't really call search and rescue or anything, so we didn't call anyone else in. It just sort of like unfolded slowly, and I don't know at what point you'd do that, but yeah, and honestly, I don't know if they would have been helpful, but it was a long time, right? And like we got to the point where we had tried a lot of different things, and it was like maybe that could have been a good idea.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. That's a tough one, huh? Like if you would have done it within the first 15 minutes or something, maybe they would have been out there and
it just felt to me the whole time like we were one thing away from getting him out. You know what I mean? So it was like,
yeah,
felt like you were so close.
I could very easily see not doing it, just thinking like we've got people here, we're doing it, we're going to get them out. That's an interesting one. Anything?
That's something like, Scott mentioned. Actually, he said like, you know, we talked about chasing his paddle and then someone swimming, and I think he looked around and saw that someone was missing and figured they had gone for help, and I guess kind of cheered him up partway through. But he was like thinking, you know, a team was going to show up at any point. But
it's impressive that he had the presence of mind to notice that and think about that too, actually.
Yeah.
What about like leading up to it? Do you think there was anything? Or I mean, it sounded like you guys were a good group and you were trying, you scouted stuff. It sounded like you were generally being smart about it.
Yeah, I think we were being really smart about running the river, and we were a good group that was used to running rivers together, especially of that grade. But I don't know, it's a tough one, man. Like it wasn't apparent, and the rapid, I remember it being not steep enough that you'd really want to scout it, and
Yeah. I mean, the
it's a
fact that it
weird
happened to
one.
two other groups in the same time period tells you something, right? It sounds like it was just a really badly placed log.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of wood in that river, and I think we all sort of laughed it off in the beginning, and maybe we probably shouldn't have, right? Like what you were saying, we were trying to like make it a game to knock it out of our boat around the class one log jams, and
but you get so complacent with wood, like it sucks to say, and you really shouldn't. But in the Pacific Northwest and in BC, there's a lot of wood, and you're in a weird state of always being ready for it and always being ready to deal with it, but also I find kind of being complacent with it because you know you're going to run into wood, and you know you generally know what to do, and you don't think that bad of things will happen. But then you
Yeah.
see things like this. You see things like there was that video from a few years ago on the Middle Fork Nook Sack, in that one rapid where there was a piece of wood and the guy got just wedged right in under it in a slot rapid. There was another one in like a class 3 river in Oregon I remember seeing a video of, and it always happens where you don't think it's going to happen. And this was a rapid where we definitely didn't think it was going to happen, in my opinion anyway.
Yeah. And to some extent, you can't just scour every inch of the river looking for dangerous logs hidden under the water, right?
Yeah.
But that's tough. I mean, I know I've through the years I've tried to control the variables, and obviously there's always some degree of risk when you're running whitewater, but you try to control as many variables as possible. But wood's always a scary one. Um,
Yeah.
but it's interesting to hear your perspective from this pretty crazy situation.
I will say though, on the going back to the hard points on the boat, note that I was just making fun of Scott for his Waka OG grab or hard points like 2 days ago.
That's awesome.
Are the wakas? I know there's been crap that I've heard about the wakas and that being like, I think people have complained about it being a weak point, which Waka said like no way. But is it similar to the Prion where it doesn't hold its shape? That it's like could potentially fold underwater.
I think I think they bend. Like that's one thing Scott mentioned, and it came up because we were on a multi-day and we were just like tandem carrying our boats, and I was joking that like I was holding a stern loop and that it was just going to break. Uh, but yeah, he was talking about the front one, and I guess he like tied a rope to it or something, like the way he loaded on his car, and it had like permanently bent a little bit.
Huh.
But I think if I'm not mistaken, Waka's updated those on their new boats, and they are like a more robust handle.
Okay.
But I
It looks like they're at least tight enough. I'm looking at a picture right now. Looks like they're at least tight enough that they're like they kind of maintain their shape. But that's a super interesting point that I'd never thought about was this idea that like it can be hard to get a beaner through there if it's folding or not maintaining its shape.
Oh, dude, the old piranhas, like prior to 2015 or 14 or something, were the worst. Those old yellow, like fabric handles that had very little shape to
Yeah.
them. Like those,
I,
that would have been useless in this situation.
yep. I know exactly what you're talking about.
But a lot of the newer boats, it seems like that's been addressed, I think. So
We are
piranhas.
evolving. Boats are getting better for safety too.
We talked about the pillar too in his boat because I think he used it to
Oh
like
yeah,
step out.
Yeah, that's a really
dude,
good point.
that's right. And that's another good point because his Prion Pure didn't have a step out pillar. Like there's no center pillar in a Prion Pure, so he wouldn't have been able to step out, right?
Yeah, I think that's a big deal. I had one of the Callies, and at that point they were starting to offer. Prion was offering like with pillar, without pillar, and I definitely got the pillar, both for the integrity, right? Because their claim is that that plastic is so tough, which is there's some legitimacy to it that you don't need a pillar and you can save weight and have more space in your boat to put stuff and whatnot. But right, it's not just about the rigidity of the boat; it's also that ability to step out in a situation like that.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy.
Although I guess you could argue that his foot could have gotten stuck, like between the pillar and plastic folding or something like that. It doesn't sound like that was the case for him, but you potentially see that where the boat starts to fold over your feet, right?
Yeah, or maybe if he'd been in a Prion Pure, he wouldn't have got it as stuck because there's more room in the cockpit. Like, you know,
Yeah, I mean that's a factor too, huh? How roomy it is in your leg area and around the cockpit. Things we don't
yeah,
want to think about when we're buying boats, but become important when you need them, huh?
yeah, it's true. It's true. But technology's like it's it's so much better now. It's so nice when you're buying a boat to know that at least you're getting like something better than you did back pre 2012. It seems like at least, no matter what you're buying.
All right. Well, thanks for sharing. Appreciate you putting yourselves out there too, because whenever there's a situation like that, you open yourself up to criticism. But it sounded to me like you guys had a pretty tight group that did a good job in a pretty tough situation.
Yeah, I think it's good. And I think like any criticism for a situation like this can only be positive ultimately, right? It only creates conversation, really.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to look at it. If we don't share these things, then we don't learn. Information doesn't get dispensed, and I think it's hearing about these things that they can happen to regular boaters and like class four, like doesn't have to be class five, right? It can just be any kind of situation with some powerful water, and it's good to be aware that you need to be prepared even for situations where you might not be on red alert for a bad thing happening.
I'd even say it almost happens more often on class three, class four work, because that's when you're not expecting it, right? Class five, you're on your game and you're looking at everything and you're thinking about stuff at more of a heightened level, whereas class three, four, you're just going through the motions a little bit more and you're not taking it maybe as seriously, even though you should be, right?
I think there's a lot to that. Yeah, just maintaining that awareness no matter what. It's really important. All right. Well, thanks, guys. Appreciate you so much for coming on and spending a little time.
Awesome.
Cool. Thank you,
Yeah,
Kevin. Yeah.
thanks, Kevin.